Something else that people asked about in this previous video was where I mentioned the fact that I have these audible alarms. So let me show you the actual alarm file that I use for this roast. And every single roast that I do has a slightly different alarm file. So parts of this are kind of boilerplate, like when do I load the beans? I have different beans, and I've learned that some of them I want to load them at a lower temperature so that the roast is slower. Other beans I load at a higher temperature. So when this environmental temperature here, the ET, gets up to 260 degrees, it calls this batch file, loadbeans.bat. And this is literally located in the artisan subdirectory underneath here where I've installed the software. The artisan roaster scope software is in this folder, and then I have all these other subdirectories underneath there. But in the artisan folder I have various batch files. I have a check variac batch file, a first crack batch file, and a load beans batch file. So what that looks like is it just says, well, it calls a program called saystatic.exe, and it literally talks through the speakers on the computer and says load beans in 5 degrees. As a matter of fact, I can probably run it right now.
Load beans in 5 degrees. Load beans in 5 degrees.
So you may have heard that. It's kind of soft the way I have my speaker set at the moment. But this is what happens when this particular alarm is triggered. The next one is based on a bean temperature of 275, which means I'm getting close to my drying temperature of 280 on my roaster, and it calls something called check variac, and that's a reminder that I may need to adjust the voltage going into the roaster. I do that with an external electronic device called a variac, but I'm not going to talk about that anymore. Then I have these other alarms. So when the bean temperature gets above 280, I'm not actually changing the temperature here. It remains, or excuse me, the heat level remains at 100%, but I do turn on the fan. I set the fan to 25%, and you can see that as this identifier right here. That's where I got to the 280 degrees, and notice I've used these funny little diamonds to indicate the fan level. So that's where the fan goes to 25%, and then you can see later on it gets adjusted again. So let me go back to the alarm file. So the next time that we make a modification is when we get to about 40 degrees from first crack. So again, this is why each one of these files is slightly different for each bean. I actually keep track of where first crack is, and I've recorded that based on prior roasts. So what I do is before I get to first crack, I adjust the temperature. So for example here, when I get my environmental temperature above 395, I was changing the slider power and the slider fan. Well, this is a very, very old alarm file. I don't actually even do it this way anymore. But what I was trying to do was to figure out about 2 minutes before first crack, I wanted to reduce the heat from 100% to 80%, and I bump up the fan from 25% to 50%. So I have this reminder here about first crack then is the next thing that happens, which tells me I'm getting close to first crack. That's just so I wake up and I start, I actually write down a whole lot of data while I'm doing these roasts. So you can see first crack actually occurred at 10:30, and I was reducing the heat and bumping up the fan at about 8:45. So this is the idea of these alarm files. When you are using this Arduino board and this TC4C shield for it, it actually allows you to control the roaster from the computer. So this software here, the artisan software, is running on the computer, it's running through this electronics, and it's pretty magical that by using these alarm files I can actually control the heat and the power and everything else in the roaster. And this is all stuff that I used to do manually. So all of these minute little changes here The advantage of having this automated is I don't have to do all of these things manually. I can override any of these things I want to after the fact, but this really makes it a lot easier to just reproduce the roasts over and over again. So it's one of the things that I truly love about coffee roasting is using the artisan software.